Mom, this is Clarice. She saved the wedding. Cynthia freezes. She knows that face. She held it once, wrapped in pink, and let it go. 24 years later, that face just walked down the aisle as her daughter's bridesmaid. Comment where you're listening from today. Take a breath and listen closely. Cynthia Henderson stood in her pristine kitchen, carefully arranging white roses in a crystal vase. Everything had to be perfect for tomorrow, her daughter Beatrice's wedding day. After months of planning, every detail was finally falling into place. The caterers confirmed, the venue decorated, and the photographer ready to capture what would surely be the happiest day of their lives. "Mom, you're going to wear yourself out," Beatrice called from the living room, where she was addressing the last few thank you cards. She was the picture of grace and elegance, her blonde hair cascading over her shoulders as she worked. Cynthia smiled, watching her daughter through the doorway. Beatrice had always been their pride and joy. Valedictorian, college graduate, now marrying a wonderful man from a good family. The Hendersons had built what everyone considered the perfect life in their suburban neighborhood. Successful careers, a beautiful home, and a daughter who exceeded every expectation. "I just want everything to be beautiful for you, sweetheart," Cynthia replied, adjusting a rose that was already perfectly positioned. Jerry Henderson looked up from his newspaper, his reading glasses perched on his nose. "It will be perfect, just like our little girl," he said with the same proud smile he'd worn since Beatrice took her first steps. But perfection, Cynthia had learned long ago, came at a price, one she'd convinced herself was worth paying. The phone rang, interrupting her thoughts. Beatrice's maid of honor, calling with a last-minute question about the ceremony timing. As Cynthia listened to the cheerful chatter about bouquets and photographs, she felt a familiar tightness in her chest. For 24 years, she'd managed to keep certain memories locked away, buried beneath layers of justification and carefully constructed normalcy. "The photographer wants to do some family shots before the ceremony," Beatrice said after hanging up. "You know, the classic 3-generation pictures if Grandma feels up to it." Family shots. The words echoed in Cynthia's mind as she continued arranging flowers that didn't need arranging. Their family portrait had always been simple, clean, uncomplicated, exactly the way they'd designed it to be. Later that evening, as Cynthia lay in bed listening to Jerry's steady breathing beside her, she stared at the ceiling and tried to push away the images that always seemed to surface during quiet moments. A small bundle in pink blankets, tiny fingers wrapped around hers, eyes that would never match theirs, no matter how much love they contained. She'd made the only reasonable choice, she told herself for the 1,000th time. They were young, barely out of college, with no resources and Jerry's family threatening to disown him. They'd given that baby a chance at a better life with a family who could provide everything they couldn't. It was the responsible thing to do, the loving thing to do. Cynthia closed her eyes, willing sleep to come. Tomorrow was Beatrice's day. Tomorrow was about celebration and joy and the future they'd all built together. She had no way of knowing that tomorrow would also be the day their carefully constructed world would shatter, beginning with a face in the bridal party that would make her blood run cold. The alarm clock ticked steadily in the darkness, counting down the hours until a secret 24 years in the making would finally demand to be acknowledged. And Cynthia Henderson, who had spent decades perfecting the art of forgetting, was about to discover that some truths have a way of finding their way home. The morning sun streamed through the stained glass windows of St. Michael's Chapel, casting rainbow patterns across the marble floor. Cynthia arrived early, as she always did for important events, carrying a small emergency kit filled with safety pins, tissues, and breath mints, everything a mother of the bride might need. The venue was already bustling with activity. Florists made final adjustments to the altar arrangements, while the wedding coordinator directed traffic with military precision. Cynthia felt her shoulders relax slightly. Everything was proceeding exactly according to plan. "Mrs. Henderson!" called Esther, Beatrice's college roommate and maid of honor, rushing over with her characteristic enthusiasm. "Beatrice is in the bridal suite, getting her makeup done. The photographer wants to start with the bridesmaids in about 20 minutes. Cynthia nodded approvingly. Esther had been a godsend throughout the wedding planning process, organized, reliable, and genuinely devoted to Beatrice. She'd managed to coordinate 5 bridesmaids from different stages of Beatrice's life: childhood friends, college sorority sisters, and cousins. Actually, Esther continued, lowering her voice conspiratorially, we had a bit of drama this morning. Jessica's flight got cancelled due to weather, so she won't make it. But Beatrice's friend Nadia found a replacement at the last minute. Someone from her work who's exactly Jessica's size. The dress fits perfectly, and she seems really sweet. Cynthia's stomach tightened inexplicably. A replacement? Someone Beatrice doesn't know well? Oh no, they know each other. Nadia says they've become close friends over the past few months. Beatrice was actually thrilled when she heard. Said it was meant to be. Esther beamed. You know how Beatrice always sees the silver lining in everything. Before Cynthia could ask more questions, Esther was called away by the photographer. Cynthia stood alone in the chapel's anteroom, trying to shake off an uncomfortable feeling she couldn't name. She'd always been protective of Beatrice, perhaps overly so, but something about this last-minute change felt unsettling. The sound of laughter echoed from the bridal suite upstairs. Cynthia climbed the curved staircase, her heels clicking against the polished wood. The door to the suite was slightly ajar, and she could hear Beatrice's voice mixed with those of her bridesmaids. Mom, Beatrice called out as Cynthia entered. Come meet everyone properly before we get too crazy with photos. The room was a cheerful chaos of satin, tulle, and nervous energy. Beatrice sat in front of a large mirror, while a makeup artist applied the finishing touches to her already radiant face. 4 bridesmaids in soft lavender dresses clustered around, adjusting each other's hair and sharing stories. You remember my cousins Jenny and Kate, Beatrice said, gesturing to 2 young women Cynthia had known since they were children. And Esther, of course. And this is my friend from college, Lisa. Cynthia smiled and nodded at each familiar face, her tension beginning to ease. These were good girls from good families, exactly the kind of friends she'd always hoped Beatrice would choose. And Mom, Beatrice continued, her voice carrying a note of particular warmth, I want you to meet Clarice. She stepped in for Jessica at the last minute. Isn't that wonderful? Cynthia turned toward the 5th bridesmaid, who had been adjusting her dress near the window. The young woman straightened and faced her, extending a graceful hand. Mrs. Henderson, it's such an honor to meet you. Beatrice talks about you all the time. The world seemed to tilt on its axis. Standing before Cynthia was a young woman of perhaps 24, with rich mahogany skin and startlingly familiar eyes. Jerry's eyes, the same unusual shade of green that had first caught Cynthia's attention in college. But it was more than just the eyes. The shape of her face, the way she held her head slightly tilted when she smiled, the graceful gesture of her hands. It was like looking at a ghost, made flesh. Cynthia felt her breath catch in her throat. Her carefully extended hand trembled slightly as Clarice shook it with genuine warmth. I'm so sorry about the last-minute change, Clarice continued, seemingly unaware of Cynthia's distress. When Nadia mentioned that Beatrice needed help, I couldn't say no. She's been such a wonderful friend to me since I started at the marketing firm. I feel incredibly lucky to be included in such a special day. Of course, Cynthia managed to whisper, though her voice sounded foreign to her own ears. Any friend of Beatrice's? Beatrice beamed from her seat at the mirror. Clarice just moved here from Portland last year. Can you believe she didn't know a soul in the city when she arrived? She's so brave. I could never pick up and start over somewhere completely new. Sometimes starting over is exactly what you need, Clarice said softly, and something in her tone made Cynthia's chest tighten further. Sometimes you have to leave the past behind to find where you really belong. And the makeup artist stepped back to admire her work. Perfect, Beatrice, you're absolutely glowing. As the room erupted in compliments and excitement, Cynthia excused herself and stepped into the hallway. Her hands were shaking as she gripped the ornate banister. It couldn't be possible. It was just a coincidence, a cruel trick of genetics and timing. But as she stood there, trying to convince herself she was imagining things, She heard Clarice laugh at something one of the other bridesmaids said. The sound was achingly familiar, exactly like Beatrice's laugh, but with a slightly deeper timbre. The same laugh that had echoed through their house for years, now coming from a stranger who couldn't possibly be a stranger. Cynthia pulled out her phone and called Jerry, who was getting ready at home with the groomsmen. "Honey, what's wrong?" he answered immediately, recognizing something in her voice. "There's been a change," she whispered, moving further down the hallway. "A last-minute addition to the bridal party. Jerry, I think we need to talk." "What kind of change?" Before Cynthia could answer, Beatrice's voice called from the bridal suite. "Mom, the photographer's ready for us." Cynthia closed her eyes, 24 years of carefully maintained composure threatening to crumble. "I have to go. Just be prepared for anything today." She hung up and returned to the bridal suite, where Clarice was helping Beatrice with her veil. Watching them together, the daughter she'd raised and the daughter she'd given away, Cynthia felt the full weight of choices made long ago pressing down on her shoulders. As they prepared for the photo session, Cynthia caught Clarice studying her with those familiar green eyes, a puzzled expression crossing her face as if she, too, sensed something she couldn't quite name. The photographer's voice echoed up the stairs. "Ladies, we're ready for you." Cynthia forced a smile and followed the bridal party toward the door, knowing that each step brought them closer to a reckoning she'd spent decades avoiding. The photo session felt like walking through a minefield. Cynthia stood frozen as the photographer arranged the bridal party on the chapel steps, watching Clarice move with unconscious grace beside Beatrice. Every gesture, every smile, every tilt of her head reminded Cynthia of moments she'd tried to forget. Holding a tiny baby who shared those same features, making an impossible choice in a sterile hospital room. "Perfect. Now let's have the mother of the bride join us," the photographer called cheerfully. Cynthia's legs felt unsteady as she approached the group. Clarice stepped aside to make room, and their eyes met for a brief moment. Cynthia saw something flicker across the young woman's face. Recognition, confusion, or perhaps just polite curiosity about why the mother of the bride looked so shaken. "Mrs. Henderson, are you feeling all right?" Clarice asked quietly, her voice carrying genuine concern. "You look a bit pale." "Just wedding nerves," Cynthia managed, though her voice sounded strained even to her own ears. Beatrice overheard and immediately turned her attention to her mother. "Mom, sit down for a minute. Esther, can you get her some water?" No, I'm fine," Cynthia protested. But Beatrice was already guiding her to a nearby bench. Clarice followed, her brow creased with worry. "My adopted mother used to get these spells," Clarice said softly, settling beside Cynthia on the bench. "Especially during stressful times. She said they were like echoes of old grief that would just hit her sometimes." Cynthia's heart nearly stopped. "Your adopted mother?" "Yes. She passed away 3 years ago. Cancer." Clarice's voice carried a weight of loss that seemed far too heavy for someone so young. "That's actually part of why I moved here. After she died, I realized I had nothing keeping me in Portland except her memory. I thought maybe it was time to try to find some answers about where I came from." The photographer was calling for them to return, but Cynthia couldn't move. She watched as Clarice rejoined the group, her mind racing. 3 years ago. The timing made her stomach clench, with a mixture of guilt and fear. During the ceremony prep, Cynthia found herself studying Clarice with desperate intensity. The young woman moved through the preparations with quiet efficiency, helping Beatrice with her train, offering tissues to emotional relatives, and charming Jerry's elderly aunts with her gentle manner. She fit seamlessly into their world, as if she'd always belonged there. It was during a quiet moment, as they waited for the processional to begin, that Cynthia overheard a conversation that made her blood run cold. "So, how did you and Beatrice really meet?" asked Jenny, Beatrice's cousin, as the bridesmaids made final adjustments to their appearance. Clarice smiled, but Cynthia caught something guarded in her expression. "Through work, mostly. But it's funny. When I first moved here, I kept running into her everywhere. The coffee shop near my apartment, the gym, even the bookstore where I like to browse on weekends. It was like the universe was trying to tell us we should be friends. "That's so sweet," Esther exclaimed. "Don't you love how some friendships just feel meant to be?" "Yes," Clarice said quietly, but her eyes found Cynthia across the room. "Sometimes I think certain connections are deeper than we realize, like we're drawn to people for reasons we don't fully understand." Cynthia felt dizzy. The casual encounters, the gradual friendship, the convenient last-minute invitation to be a bridesmaid, none of it felt random anymore. But if Clarice suspected something, why hadn't she said anything directly? Why this elaborate charade? The wedding coordinator appeared, clipboard in hand. "Ladies, it's time. Processional order, please." As they lined up, Cynthia caught Beatrice's arm. "Sweetheart, I need to step outside for just a moment. Get some air." Beatrice's face filled with concern. "Mom, what's wrong? You've been acting strange all morning." "Nothing's wrong. I just need a minute to collect myself." But as Cynthia moved toward the door, she nearly collided with Jerry, who was arriving with the groomsmen. One look at his face told her that her phone call had unsettled him more than she'd realized. "Cynthia, we need to talk," he said urgently, taking her arm and guiding her to a quiet corner of the vestibule. "Not now, Jerry. The ceremony is about to start." "Is it her?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "The bridesmaid you mentioned?" Cynthia's silence was answer enough. Jerry's face went ashen. "How is that possible?" he whispered. "How did she find us? How did she get close to Beatrice?" "I don't know," Cynthia admitted. "But Jerry, she's been Beatrice's friend for months. This isn't some sudden appearance. She's been in our daughter's life, and we had no idea." The sound of the organ beginning the processional music interrupted them. Through the doorway, they could see the bridesmaids taking their positions. "We have to get through this ceremony," Cynthia said firmly, though her hands were trembling. "Whatever this is, whatever she wants, we deal with it after Beatrice's wedding. We will not ruin our daughter's day." Jerry nodded, though he looked as shaken as Cynthia felt. They separated, him to take his place with the groomsmen, her to find her seat in the front pew. As the processional began, Cynthia watched each bridesmaid walk down the aisle. When Clarice appeared, moving with quiet dignity in her lavender dress, Cynthia felt the weight of 24 years of secrets pressing down on her chest. But it was what happened next that nearly undid her completely. As Clarice reached the front of the church and took her place, she turned slightly, and her gaze found Cynthia in the front row. For just a moment, their eyes locked across the flower-filled space. And in that moment, Cynthia saw something that made her heart race. Not just recognition, but a deep, unmistakable sadness. Clarice knew. Somehow, she knew exactly who Cynthia was. The realization hit Cynthia like a physical blow. This wasn't a coincidence at all. Clarice hadn't stumbled into Beatrice's life by chance. She had sought them out, carefully and deliberately, building a friendship with the sister she'd never known, working her way into their family circle. But why? What did she want? And more terrifyingly, what did she plan to do with the knowledge she so clearly possessed? The organ music swelled, and Beatrice appeared at the back of the church on her father's arm, radiant and oblivious to the drama unfolding around her. Cynthia forced herself to stand with the rest of the congregation, to smile and celebrate this moment she'd dreamed of for years. But as she watched her daughter walk down the aisle toward her future, Cynthia couldn't shake the feeling that their carefully constructed past was about to collide with the present in ways that would change everything. Clarice stood at the altar, her hands folded peacefully, her expression serene. But Cynthia caught the way her fingers trembled slightly against her bouquet, the only sign that she, too, was struggling to maintain her composure. The ceremony was about to begin, but Cynthia knew that the real drama, the reckoning she'd spent decades avoiding, was still to come. And judging by the determined set of Clarice's shoulders, it wouldn't be long now. As the minister began to speak, Cynthia closed her eyes and prayed that whatever Clarice had planned, it wouldn't destroy the family they'd worked so hard to build. But deep in her heart, she feared it was already too late. The ceremony proceeded like a beautiful dream wrapped in a nightmare. Cynthia sat rigidly in the front pew, her hands clasped so tightly her knuckles had turned white. Every word of the minister's sermon about love, commitment, and family felt like a personal indictment of the choices she'd made 24 years ago. Beatrice looked radiant as she exchanged vows with Jim, her voice clear and strong as she promised to love and cherish him through whatever challenges life might bring. Cynthia felt tears streaming down her face, tears of joy for her daughter's happiness mixed with terror about what was coming. Throughout the ceremony, Cynthia found her gaze drawn repeatedly to Clarice, who stood with perfect composure beside the other bridesmaids. But Cynthia noticed things others might miss. The way Clarice's eyes lingered on Jerry when he wasn't looking, studying his profile with quiet intensity. The slight catch in her breath when Beatrice mentioned family during her personal vows. The careful way she avoided looking directly at Cynthia, except for that one devastating moment of recognition. When the minister pronounced Beatrice and Jim husband and wife, the chapel erupted in joyful applause. Cynthia stood and clapped mechanically, her mind racing with questions and fears. As the newlyweds processed down the aisle, followed by their wedding party, Clarice walked past Cynthia's pew. Their eyes met once more, and this time Clarice offered a small, sad smile that seemed to say, "I know this is hard for you too." The receiving line at the back of the church felt like an eternity. Cynthia hugged relatives and family friends, accepted congratulations, and made appropriate responses while her mind remained fixated on Clarice, who was helping Beatrice with her dress and chatting easily with the other bridesmaids. "Cynthia, dear, you must be so proud," said Mrs. Patterson, their longtime neighbor. "Beatrice looks absolutely beautiful, and that young man seems wonderful. You've raised such a lovely daughter." "Thank you," Cynthia managed, the words feeling hollow in her mouth. One lovely daughter. The daughter they'd kept and nurtured and celebrated. What about the daughter they'd given away? Jerry appeared at her elbow, his face pale but determined. "The photographer wants some family shots before we head to the reception," he said quietly. "We need to get through this." The photo session in the church garden felt surreal. Cynthia stood between Jerry and Beatrice, smiling for the camera while her world tilted on its axis. When the photographer asked for a shot of the whole wedding party family, Clarice stepped into the frame, and Cynthia felt the irony like a physical blow. Here they were, the whole family together for the first time in 24 years, and no one except 3 of them knew it. "Everyone say cheese," the photographer called out cheerfully. Cynthia looked at the camera and tried to smile, but all she could think about was how the photo would look to future generations. Beatrice's children and grandchildren would see this picture someday, never knowing that one of the bridesmaids was actually their aunt. After the photos, as guests began making their way to cars for the short drive to the reception venue, Cynthia saw her chance. Clarice was standing alone near the garden fountain, checking her phone with a pensive expression. Cynthia approached slowly, her heart hammering in her chest. "Clarice, may I speak with you for a moment?" The young woman looked up, and Cynthia was struck again by how much she resembled Jerry, especially around the eyes. But there was something of herself there too. The determined set of her jaw, the way she held her shoulders when facing a difficult situation. "Of course, Mrs. Henderson." Clarice's voice was calm, but Cynthia could see tension in the lines around her eyes. They walked to a quiet corner of the garden, away from the lingering guests and wedding party. For a long moment, neither spoke. Cynthia stared at this young woman who was a stranger and yet achingly familiar, searching for the right words to begin a conversation 24 years in the making. "You know, don't you?" Cynthia finally whispered. Clarice nodded slowly. "I've known for 3 months. Since I first saw your family photo on Beatrice's desk at work." The simple admission hit Cynthia like a blow. 3 months, she repeated numbly. "You've known for 3 months and said nothing. What was I supposed to say?" Clarice's voice carried a note of pain beneath its calm exterior. "Hi, I'm the daughter you abandoned. Nice to meet you after all these years." Cynthia flinched at the word abandoned, but she didn't deny it. How did you find us?" Clarice was quiet for a moment, her gaze fixed on the fountain. After my adoptive mother died, I decided to search for my birth parents. I hired a private investigator. It took almost a year, but eventually we found the records. Your names, the hospital, the date, all of it. And you came here specifically to find us? I came here to see what kind of people you were, whether you'd built a good life, whether you were happy. Clarice's voice grew softer. Whether you ever thought about me. Cynthia felt tears burning her eyes. We thought about you every day, she whispered. Did you? The question carried years of pain. Because from where I stood, it looked like you built the perfect family and never looked back. Beatrice has every advantage, every opportunity. She's confident and loved and secure in ways I never was. We were so young, Cynthia said desperately. We had nothing, no money, no support from our families. You thought I'd be better off with strangers. Clarice's voice wasn't angry, just tired. Maybe you were right. The Johnsons were good people. They loved me as much as they could. But there was always this hole, this sense that part of me was missing. Cynthia watched her daughter, this daughter she'd never raised, struggle with emotions that seemed too big for her slender frame. What do you want from us? She asked quietly. Clarice looked at her directly then, and Cynthia saw the same stubborn determination that Beatrice showed when she'd made up her mind about something. I want to know if there's room in your perfect family for one more, Clarice said simply. I want to know if Beatrice would want a sister. I want to know if you and Mr. Henderson would want a daughter who comes with complications and questions and 24 years of life you weren't part of. The raw honesty in her voice broke something open in Cynthia's chest. This wasn't about revenge or destruction. This was about a young woman who'd lost the only parent she'd ever known and was desperately seeking connection, family, belonging. Clarice, Cynthia began, but the sound of Beatrice's laughter interrupted them. The bride was approaching with several of the wedding party, her face glowing with happiness. There you are, Beatrice called out. We need to get going to the reception. The band is already setting up, and I want to make sure we get all the good photos before the sun goes down. Clarice straightened, instantly transforming back into the perfect bridesmaid. Of course. I was just telling your mother how beautiful the ceremony was. Beatrice beamed and linked arms with both women. My two favorite people. Mom, isn't Clarice wonderful? I keep telling her she needs to move closer so we can see each other more often. Cynthia looked at Clarice over Beatrice's head, seeing the pain and hope warring in those familiar green eyes. The irony was almost unbearable. Beatrice was already embracing the sister she didn't know she had, already loving her with the open heart that had always been Beatrice's greatest gift. As they walked toward the cars, Beatrice chattering excitedly about the reception, Cynthia felt the weight of an impossible decision settling on her shoulders. She could try to convince Clarice to disappear again, to protect the life they'd built, or she could find the courage to tell Beatrice the truth and risk everything they'd worked so hard to create. But as she watched Beatrice and Clarice laugh together, their heads bent close as they shared some private joke, Cynthia realized the choice might already be out of her hands. Some truths, once set in motion, couldn't be stopped. The reception was about to begin, and with it, the next chapter of a story that had been 24 years in the making. The reception hall sparkled with fairy lights and white roses, every detail as perfect as Cynthia had dreamed. Round tables draped in ivory linens surrounded a polished dance floor, while the wedding cake, 3 elegant tiers adorned with sugar flowers, stood as the centerpiece of celebration. It should have been the happiest day of Cynthia's life, but she moved through the festivities, like someone sleepwalking through a beautiful nightmare. Beatrice and Jim made their grand entrance to thunderous applause, and Cynthia forced herself to clap and smile as the newlyweds took their first dance. But her eyes kept drifting to the head table, where Clarice sat with the other bridesmaids, her expression thoughtful as she watched the couple sway to their chosen song. During dinner, Cynthia barely touched her food. She listened to the best man's speech about friendship and loyalty, the maid of honor's touching tribute to Beatrice's generous heart, and felt each word like a small knife in her chest. When it came time for the traditional parent speeches, Jerry stood and raised his glass with a steady hand, though Cynthia could see the tension in his jaw. "Beatrice has been the light of our lives since the day she was born," he began, his voice carrying easily across the room. "She's brought nothing but joy and pride to our family. Watching her grow into the remarkable woman she is today has been our greatest privilege." Cynthia felt Clarice's gaze on her from across the room and couldn't bring herself to look back. Jerry continued his speech, talking about love and family and the future, while Cynthia wondered how many more lies they would have to tell before this day was over. After dinner, as guests mingled and the band played soft background music, Cynthia found herself cornered by well-meaning relatives and family friends, all eager to share their happiness for Beatrice and compliment the beautiful wedding. She smiled and nodded and said all the right things, but inside, she felt like she was drowning. "Cynthia, you must be so relieved to have everything go so smoothly," said her sister-in-law, Mary. "I know how much stress you've been under with all the planning." "Yes, it's been quite a day," Cynthia managed. "And Beatrice's friends are all so lovely. That girl Clarice, especially. What a sweet young woman. She told me the most interesting story about her work with underprivileged children. You and Jerry must be so proud of the kind of people Beatrice chooses to surround herself with." Cynthia's smile felt like it might crack her face. "Yes, very proud." As the evening progressed, Cynthia watched Beatrice move through the celebration like a radiant butterfly, dancing with Jim, chatting with guests, and sharing private moments with her bridesmaids. The sight of Beatrice and Clarice together, heads bent close, laughing at shared jokes, helping each other with touch-ups to makeup and hair, was both beautiful and heartbreaking. It was during the bouquet toss that everything began to unravel. Beatrice stood on the small stage, her back to the crowd of single women gathered behind her. Cynthia watched from the sidelines as Clarice reluctantly joined the group, encouraged by the other bridesmaids, despite her protests that she didn't want to participate. "Come on, ladies," the DJ called out. "Let's see who's going to be the next bride." Beatrice raised the bouquet high, then tossed it over her shoulder with a laugh. The flowers sailed through the air in a perfect arc, past the reaching hands of eager cousins and college friends, landing squarely in Clarice's surprised grasp. The crowd erupted in cheers and applause as Clarice stood holding the bouquet, her face flushed with embarrassment and something else, a deep sadness that only Cynthia seemed to notice. "Looks like love is in the air for you too, Clarice," Beatrice called out, rushing over to hug her friend. "I knew there was a reason you were meant to be here today." Cynthia watched the embrace between her two daughters and felt something break inside her chest. The irony was too much, Beatrice declaring that Clarice was meant to be here while having no idea just how true those words were. As the reception continued, Cynthia noticed Clarice becoming increasingly quiet. She still smiled when spoken to and participated in the festivities, but there was a fragility about her that hadn't been there earlier. She clutched Beatrice's bouquet like a lifeline, her knuckles white against the white roses and baby's breath. It was nearly 10 o'clock when Cynthia saw Clarice slip out onto the venue's garden terrace, still holding the bouquet. Cynthia followed, her heart pounding as she stepped into the cool evening air. Clarice stood at the edge of the terrace, looking out at the city lights below. She'd removed her shoes, and her lavender dress fluttered slightly in the breeze. She looked young and vulnerable, and heartbreakingly alone. "The bouquet suits you," Cynthia said softly, approaching carefully. Clarice turned, and Cynthia saw that her eyes were bright with unshed tears. "She's so happy," Clarice whispered. "Beatrice is so completely, perfectly happy. How can I be the one to change that?" Cynthia felt her own eyes filling with tears. "You don't have to." "Yes, I do." Clarice's voice was stronger now, filled with quiet determination. "I came here thinking I just wanted to see what my life might have been like. But being here, being part of this," she gestured toward the reception hall, where laughter and music spilled out into the night. "I realized I don't just want to observe from the outside anymore. I want to belong somewhere. I want a family who knows who I am." Clarice, you have to understand. I understand that you were young and scared and thought you were doing the right thing, Clarice interrupted. I understand that you built a beautiful life and raised an amazing daughter. But I also understand that I'm part of this family whether we acknowledge it or not. And I'm tired of pretending I'm not. Cynthia stared at this young woman who had her husband's eyes and her own stubborn determination and realized that the reckoning she'd been dreading was finally here. What are you going to do? Cynthia asked quietly. Clarice was quiet for a long moment, her gaze fixed on the bouquet in her hands. I'm going to tell her the truth. Tonight, before I lose my nerve. Please, Cynthia whispered. Not tonight. Not on her wedding day. Let her have this one perfect day. When then? Clarice asked, and her voice carried 24 years of pain. When would be a good time to tell someone that their parents gave away their sister and never mentioned it? When would be convenient for you to admit that your perfect family was built on a lie? Cynthia flinched at the harsh words, but she couldn't deny their truth. Give us time to figure out how to tell her gently. Please, Clarice. She's my daughter, too. She's my sister, Clarice replied, and there was steel in her voice now. And I've spent my whole life wondering if I had siblings, if there was someone out there who might understand me, who might want to know me. I found her, Cynthia. I found my sister, and she's everything I hoped for and more. I can't walk away from that. I won't. Before Cynthia could respond, the terrace door opened, and Beatrice stepped out, still glowing from her perfect day. There you are, she called out cheerfully. I've been looking everywhere for you two. Clarice, we're about to cut the cake, and I want you right up front for photos. And Mom, Jim's grandmother, wants to meet you. She's been asking about your garden. Beatrice stopped short when she saw their faces, Cynthia's pale and stricken, Clarice's filled with desperate determination. Is everything okay? Beatrice asked, her smile fading as she looked between them. You both look... Clarice straightened, still clutching the bouquet, and Cynthia knew with absolute certainty that the moment she'd been dreading for 24 years had finally arrived. Beatrice, Clarice said quietly, there's something I need to tell you, something your parents should have told you a long time ago. Cynthia watched in helpless terror as her carefully constructed world began to crumble, and her daughter's perfect wedding day transformed into the moment that would change all their lives forever. Beatrice looked between Cynthia and Clarice, her wedding dress catching the soft light from the terrace lanterns. The joy that had radiated from her all day was slowly being replaced by concern as she registered the tension crackling between the two women. What's going on? Beatrice asked again, her voice smaller now. You're both scaring me. Clarice took a deep breath, her hands trembling as she held the bouquet. Cynthia wanted to step forward, to stop what was about to happen, but her feet felt rooted to the ground. Beatrice, Clarice began, her voice barely above a whisper. I'm not just your friend from work. She paused, struggling with words that would change everything. I'm your sister. The silence that followed was deafening. Beatrice stared at Clarice, then at Cynthia, then back at Clarice, her face cycling through confusion, disbelief, and something that might have been recognition. That's not possible, Beatrice said finally, but her voice lacked conviction. I don't have a sister. I would know if I had a sister. Cynthia finally found her voice. Beatrice, sweetheart, please let us explain. Explain what? Beatrice's voice rose slightly, and Cynthia could see the moment when disbelief began transforming into something sharper. Explain how I might have a sister I never knew about? Explain how my friend just told me something that sounds completely impossible, but somehow... She looked at Clarice more closely, as if seeing her for the first time. Oh my God. Your eyes. They're exactly like Dad's. Clarice nodded, tears finally spilling over. I was born on March 15th, 2001, at Mercy General Hospital. Your parents, our parents, were 22 years old. Beatrice's hand flew to her mouth. That's impossible. Mom was in college then. She would have told me if... She stopped, the pieces clicking into place with devastating clarity. You gave her away. The last 3 words were directed at Cynthia, and they carried a weight of accusation and hurt that made Cynthia feel like she was drowning. "We were so young," Cynthia whispered, tears streaming down her face. "We had nothing. No money, no support, no way to take care of 2 babies. 2 babies! Beatrice's voice cracked. "I'm adopted too?" "No," Cynthia said quickly. "No, sweetheart. You came 2 years later, when we were more stable, when you could provide for the baby you wanted to keep," Beatrice finished, and the pain in her voice was unbearable. Clarice stepped forward. "Beatrice, please don't be angry with them. They thought they were doing the right thing. They were kids themselves." But Beatrice was staring at Cynthia with a look of betrayal that cut deeper than any knife. 24 years, Mom. 24 years you let me believe I was an only child. Do you have any idea how many times I wished for a sister? How many times I felt lonely and different and wondered what it would be like to have someone who really understood me? We thought it was better." Jerry's voice came from behind them. He had appeared in the doorway, his face gray with stress. "Better for who?" Beatrice demanded, turning to face her father. "Better for you, because it certainly wasn't better for her." She gestured to Clarice, whose quiet tears had turned into soft sobs. "And it wasn't better for me either." The terrace fell silent, except for the distant sounds of the reception continuing inside, laughter and music that now seemed to belong to a different world entirely. Beatrice looked back and forth between her parents and Clarice, and Cynthia could see her brilliant daughter's mind working, processing the implications of what she'd just learned. "All those times we ran into each other," Beatrice said slowly, looking at Clarice. "The coffee shop, the gym, the bookstore. That wasn't coincidence, was it?" Clarice shook her head. "I hired a private investigator after my adoptive mother died. I found out about you, about our parents. I moved here to see what kind of life I might have had. I never meant for us to become friends. I just wanted to observe from a distance. But then you were so kind to me, so welcoming, and I thought maybe—" "Maybe what?" "Maybe I could have a sister after all," Clarice whispered. Beatrice was quiet for a long moment, her wedding dress rustling softly in the evening breeze. When she finally spoke, her voice was steady but changed. "What's your full name?" "Clarice Marie Johnson. But my birth certificate, it says Baby Girl Henderson." Beatrice nodded slowly. "I always wondered why Mom and Dad seemed so sad every year around your birthday. I thought it was something about their college years they didn't want to talk about." Cynthia felt a fresh wave of tears. "We never forgot you. Not for a single day. But you never looked for me either," Clarice said quietly. "In 24 years, you never tried to find out if I was okay, if I was happy, if I needed you." The accusation hung in the air, and Cynthia knew it was true. They had convinced themselves that not looking was the kindest thing, that their daughter was better off without the complications of her birth parents. But looking at Clarice now, this beautiful, accomplished young woman who had spent years wondering about her origins, Cynthia realized how selfish that decision had been. "I thought about it," Jerry said quietly. "Every year on your birthday, every Christmas, I thought about trying to find you. But I was afraid. Afraid of disrupting your life, afraid of what we might find, afraid of this." He gestured to the emotional scene around them. Beatrice was quiet for several minutes, her gaze moving between her parents and Clarice. Then, with the directness that had always been part of her nature, she asked the question that had been hovering unspoken in the air. "But I don't understand something," Beatrice said, looking at Clarice and then at her parents. "How?" "I mean, you're both white, and Clarice is—" She trailed off, not wanting to sound insensitive. Cynthia felt her stomach clench. This was the other secret, the one buried even deeper than Clarice's existence. She looked at Jerry, who gave her a barely perceptible nod. "There's something else you need to know," Cynthia said quietly. "Something about our family history that we've never talked about." She took a shaky breath. looking out at the city lights as she gathered courage to reveal a truth that had been hidden for generations. My great-grandmother, your great-great-grandmother, was named Catherine Weber. This was back in the 1940s, in a time when things were very different. Cynthia's voice grew softer. She fell in love with a man named Samuel, a black man who worked at the same textile factory where she was employed. It was a love that was dangerous then, forbidden. Clarice and Beatrice listened intently, both sensing the weight of what Cynthia was sharing. They had a relationship in secret for 2 years. When Catherine became pregnant, Samuel wanted to marry her, wanted to give their child his name. But before he could, Cynthia's voice broke slightly. He was killed in an accident at the factory. He never even knew he was going to be a father. Jerry stepped closer to Cynthia, offering silent support as she continued. Catherine gave birth to a son, my grandfather, who appeared white enough to pass. The family made the decision to hide his true heritage, to raise him as if his father had been Catherine's white boyfriend who had died in the war. It was survival, really. In those days, being mixed race meant a life of hardship and limitation that they wanted to spare their child. So the genes, Beatrice began, understanding dawning in her voice. Were always there, Cynthia finished. Hidden, but there. When you were born, Beatrice, there was no sign of Samuel's heritage. But when Clarice was born, she looked at her elder daughter with eyes full of pain and love. She was beautiful, perfect, but she carried the physical traits that told the story our family had been hiding for generations. The silence stretched between them as this revelation settled over the group. We were young and terrified, Jerry added quietly. We didn't know how to explain it to our families, to the world. We convinced ourselves that giving Clarice to a family who could love her for exactly who she was would be better than trying to navigate the questions and judgments she might face with us. Clarice stared at them, processing this new layer of truth. So that's why, she whispered. I always wondered why I looked so different from my adoptive parents, why I felt like I didn't quite fit anywhere. I carry the story of a love affair from almost 80 years ago. Beatrice walked over to Clarice and gently took the bouquet from her trembling hands. You caught this, Beatrice said softly. The bouquet. In all the old traditions, that means you're supposed to be the next to find love, to find happiness. Clarice looked confused. Beatrice, But maybe, Beatrice continued, maybe it means something else. Maybe it means you've already found what you were looking for. She handed the bouquet back to Clarice. Your family, your real story, your place in our history. Clarice looked down at the flowers, then back at Beatrice. Our great-great-grandmother's love story lives on in me. And that makes you even more precious, Beatrice said firmly. You're not just my sister. You're the keeper of a love that was so strong it echoes through generations. You're the living proof that love finds a way, even when the world tries to tear it apart. Clarice's face crumpled, and she began to cry in earnest. Not the quiet tears from before, but deep, cathartic sobs that seemed to release years of pain and longing. Beatrice stepped forward, and without hesitation, wrapped her arms around Clarice in a fierce hug. I'm so sorry, she whispered. I'm so sorry you've been alone. I'm so sorry we didn't find each other sooner. Cynthia watched her daughters embrace, her daughters, together for the first time since one was a newborn, and felt something fundamental shift in her chest. The fear and guilt that had controlled her for so long began to dissolve, replaced by something she hadn't expected. Hope. I don't know how to do this, Beatrice said, pulling back to look at Clarice. I don't know how to be a sister to someone I just met, but feel like I've known forever. We'll figure it out, Clarice said, wiping her eyes. We have time now. We have the rest of our lives. Beatrice turned to her parents, and Cynthia braced herself for more anger, more accusations. Instead, Beatrice's voice was thoughtful. I understand why you made the choice you did, she said. I don't agree with it, and I'm hurt that you kept this secret for so long. But I understand that you were young and scared and thought you were doing the right thing. Jerry stepped forward. Beatrice, we're so sorry. We never meant… I know, Beatrice said, holding up her hand. We'll talk about all of this later. We have a lot to work through, but right now, she looked at Clarice, then back at her parents. Right now, I want to introduce my sister to my husband. I want to add another place setting at our table. I want to take new family photos. Real family photos, with all of us together. Cynthia felt her heart soar with unexpected joy mixed with relief. Are you sure? Beatrice smiled, the first genuine smile since the revelation began. Mom, I've spent my whole life wishing for a sister. Now I find out I've had one all along, and she's amazing, and she's been right here beside me on the most important day of my life. She linked arms with Clarice. If that's not fate, I don't know what is. As they walked back toward the reception together, all four of them, a family complete for the first time in 24 years, Cynthia realized that sometimes the most frightening truths could lead to the most beautiful transformations. The wedding reception was still in full swing, but for the Henderson family, the real celebration was just beginning. 6 months later, Cynthia stood in her kitchen arranging flowers. Not white roses this time, but a cheerful mix of daisies and sunflowers that Clarice had brought from her new apartment just 10 minutes away. The house felt different now, fuller somehow, with the addition of Sunday dinners that included both daughters, game nights that ran late into the evening, and the constant comfortable chaos of a family learning to be together after years apart. Beatrice and Jim had returned from their honeymoon with hundreds of photos and countless stories, but the picture that held the place of honor on Cynthia's mantle was the one from the wedding reception, taken after the revelation, showing 4 people who had finally found their way back to each other. It hadn't been easy. There had been difficult conversations, therapy sessions, and moments when Cynthia wondered if they would ever truly heal from the years of separation. But love, she had discovered, was stronger than secrets. And family, real family, was worth every difficult step of the journey home. When Clarice knocked on the door that Sunday morning, Cynthia opened it with a smile that came easily now, welcoming her daughter, both her daughters, into the life they were building together, one precious day at a time. If you made it this far, thank you for listening. Sometimes the past doesn't knock. It walks right in, wearing a lavender dress, calling your daughter her best friend. If this story moved you, share it, and I'll see you